At 6:32 on April 21, 1944, Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell stood beside a P-51 Mustang at Debden Airfield in England, watching Lieutenant James Parker approach an aircraft containing a critical vulnerability no maintenance could resolve. The 22-year-old pilot had completed 14 combat missions with 3 confirmed kills, yet now faced flying directly into newly positioned German 88mm flak batteries surrounding Berlin during a bomber escort mission to Parchim. Having maintained P-51 Mustangs for 7 months, Mitchell understood these aircraft intimately. Their single-engine design, laminar flow wings, exceptional speed across all altitudes, an impressive 1,600-mile range with external fuel tanks made them the world's finest escort fighters. However, the P-51 possessed one fatal weakness, claiming American pilots weakly: its liquid-cooled engine system. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine depended on ethylene glycol coolant circulating through the engine block, brass cylinder head tubes, a header tank behind the propeller, and exposed lines connecting to a belly-mounted radiator, with the entire system holding approximately 17 gallons of coolant. A single bullet penetrating any component would cause engine overheating within 3 to 7 minutes, leaving pilots barely enough time to either attempt landing or bail out over hostile territory. Official American doctrine instructed P-51 pilots to maintain high altitude, avoid ground fire, focus on escort duties, and utilize speed and elevation to stay beyond small arms range. But Parker had followed these guidelines 13 times without avoiding damage. The 8th Air Force had lost over 500 P-51s during the previous 6 months, most falling not to German fighters but to ground fire, flak fragments, or rifle rounds piercing aluminum skin and severing coolant lines. Mitchell had witnessed too many pilots returning with white glycol vapor trailing behind their aircraft, engine temperatures climbing past 100 degrees Celsius toward the critical 110 degrees Celsius threshold. Some made it back, but most didn't. Training manuals blamed tactical errors and doctrine violations, yet Mitchell knew the true culprit was the cooling system itself. Though elegantly designed and efficient, utilizing the Meredith effect to recover drag penalty from the radiator, the system remained critically vulnerable with exposed coolant lines running through the aircraft structure, a thinly walled header tank behind the propeller, and the radiator suspended in the belly intake, exposed to fire from below. A solitary .30 caliber bullet could puncture any component, while shrapnel from an 88mm shell could tear through coolant lines, initiating irreversible leakage without backup tanks or in-flight repair options, leaving pilots mere minutes to decide between reaching friendly territory or parachuting into enemy hands. Mitchell had raised this concern with engineering officers 4 months earlier, only to learn the cooling system met all specifications from North American Aviation and Packard, with any redesign requiring right field approval 4,000 miles away, a process taking months or years that pilots simply didn't have. So Mitchell performed what limited maintenance he could, checking every cooling connection before flights, torque testing hose clamps, pressure testing header tanks, and searching for cracks or corrosion, though he couldn't armor lines or add redundancy to address the fundamental vulnerability every P-51 carried into combat. The first pilot Mitchell lost to cooling system failure was Second Lieutenant David Chen on March 19, 1944, a fellow Californian from San Francisco with whom he'd shared conversations about home and automotive work before the war. Chen took off at 0645 for a fighter sweep over France, returning 3 hours later with his temperature gauge reading 108 degrees Celsius and white vapor streaming behind his aircraft after a small caliber round pierced the belly skin and clipped a radiator coolant line during a strafing pass near Abbeville. Despite immediately breaking off the attack, climbing, and heading towards England, Chen watched his temperature rise for 18 minutes until the engine seized 4 miles from Debden, crashing in a field 3 miles short of the runway. The official report cited pilot error for not bailing out over the channel, but Mitchell knew Chen simply tried saving his aircraft and returning home, killed by the cooling system nonetheless. The second loss was First Lieutenant William Morrison on April 7th, an experienced flight leader with 9 kills and 28 missions who understood the P-51's strengths and vulnerabilities thoroughly. While providing close escort to B-17s over Brunswick at 22,000 feet, Morrison's aircraft sustained shrapnel damage from an 88mm shell burst 20 feet away, with one 3-inch fragment severing the coolant line between the header tank and radiator. Morrison reported the coolant leak and rising temperature immediately, remaining with the bombers for 6 additional minutes during their bombing run, before breaking west toward friendly airspace over the Netherlands. His engine temperature reached 112 degrees Celsius, exceeding maximum permissible levels, causing cylinder head warping before seizing over the Zuiderzee at 8,000 feet, leading to a fatal crash landing attempt on a Dutch beach. Morrison's crew chief Rodriguez, a Texan friend of Mitchell's, became convinced about the cooling system's weakness after reviewing maintenance records showing 27 of 42 P-51 losses during the previous 3 months resulted from cooling system failures after battle damage, despite official reports blaming tactics and altitude violations. By mid-April, Mitchell had watched 11 squadron pilots die, some known well, others briefly met during pre-flight checks, all whose aircraft he'd maintained, whose coolant levels he'd checked, whose radiators he'd tested, and whose hose clamps he'd torqued, following every procedure correctly, yet losing them regardless. The distinctive sound of an engine seizing, sudden silence replacing the Merlin's roar, had reached Mitchell 4 times, with 2 pilots crash landing successfully and 2 parachuting into disappearance. Each morning in the maintenance area filled with ethylene glycol and hot metal smells meant coolant flowed, engines ran, and aircraft prepared for combat. Though some would return trailing vapor, others wouldn't return at all, and Mitchell would repeat the same maintenance rituals the next day, watching more pilots board aircraft vulnerable to single bullets. On April 20th, Parker visited the maintenance area, asking if anything could protect the coolant system after witnessing Morrison's and Chen's losses, not wanting to die from a stray round hitting a coolant line. Mitchell saw the fear and desperation in the young pilot's eyes, someone aware of his vulnerability during low flights through flak and ground fire, and admitted nothing could be done systemically, though he agreed to double clamp all coolant connections against vibration loosening. Working alone after 2,200 hours in the quiet maintenance hangar, Mitchell removed cowling panels from Parker's P-51, inspecting every coolant connection at the header tank, radiator inlet and outlet, and cylinder head manifolds, adding second clamps positioned 90 degrees from the originals, not bulletproof, but potentially containing leaks from vibration, completing the 3-hour task with glycol-covered hands and an aching back, before replacing panels and cleaning tools by 0115. The distant sound of RAF bombers departing on night raids made Mitchell's stomach clench, knowing Parker would take off in 6 hours and be over Germany in 7 unprotected from the single bullet that could bring him down. Parker departed at 06:52 as Mitchell watched the P-51 climb into the morning sky among 16 aircraft heading southeast toward Germany, then waited 4 hours and 37 minutes for their return at 11:29 with only 15 aircraft, Parker's tail number absent. The operations officer reported Parker hit by flak over the target, trailing vapor while staying with bombers for 10 minutes as his temperature passed 100 degrees Celsius, before breaking west toward friendly territory, last seen losing altitude over western Germany with vapor trailing and temperature exceeding 110 degrees Celsius, disappearing without bailout or crash confirmation, possibly landing safely, becoming a POW, or dying in a sudden engine seizure. That evening, Rodriguez visited Mitchell's work area, having heard about Parker and 6 other P-51s lost that week to cooling system hits. 3 dead, 2 missing, 1 badly injured, insisting something must change, though Mitchell questioned what could be done without right field authorization for redesigns or armor additions. Then Major General James Doolittle's late April decision changed 8th Air Force mission profiles, freeing fighters from close bomber escort to range ahead, sweep for German fighters, attack airfields and destroy ground targets, aggressive, risky missions labeled fighter sweeps, and Chattanooga missions that P-51 pilots embraced for their hunting freedom, but which increased losses immediately. In May 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 93 P-51s, with 41% from strafing missions involving ground fire, small arms, light flak, coolant system punctures, engine seizures, and downed pilots. Statistics showing P-51 pilots had better odds in dogfights against Messerschmitt Bf-109s than during strafing passes over German airfields, since Luftwaffe pilots could be outmaneuvered while ground fire couldn't. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, surviving Parker's and Morrison's losses with 26 missions and 5 kills, experienced this during a May 19th fighter sweep over northeast France, attacking a German supply convoy near Reims when a sharp bang under his left foot accompanied an immediate temperature gauge jump, followed by white glycol mist streaming from the cowling 30 seconds later. Hayes reduced power to minimum cruise, stabilizing temperature at 106 degrees Celsius with 180 miles and 40 minutes remaining to Debden, holding 4 degrees margin until temperatures climbed again.
Following the war, Mitchell returned to Los Angeles and established an automotive garage in 1946, where he repaired vehicles for 40 years, while rarely discussing his experiences with P-51 Mustangs. When curious customers inquired about his military service, he simply identified himself as a former aircraft mechanic, without elaborating on the cooling systems he had maintained, or the 19 pilots he had watched perish. Hayes returned to his native Iowa, married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and worked 37 years as a commercial airline pilot. Yet every April 21st, he remembered Lieutenant James Parker disappearing over Germany with rising engine temperature and no means of salvation. Rodriguez remained in the Air Force until 1963, advancing to Master Sergeant and training generations of jet engine mechanics, consistently incorporating the cautionary tale of the P-51's cooling system vulnerability into his instruction. The story of how an exceptional aircraft's fatal flaw claimed 19 pilots from a single squadron. In 1991, a military aviation historian researching P-51 combat losses discovered numerous references to cooling system vulnerabilities within maintenance logs and combat reports from English airfields. Tracking Mitchell through veteran registries, the 74-year-old former mechanic, still working part-time in his garage, confirmed what official records suggested. The P-51's cooling system represented a known vulnerability that mechanics and pilots recognized but could never resolve. The historian subsequently estimated that cooling system failures following battle damage accounted for approximately 500 to 600 P-51 losses throughout the war, with most affected pilots either dying or becoming prisoners of war. The historical analysis concluded that redundant cooling systems, protected coolant lines, or air-cooled engine designs might have saved numerous pilots, though such modifications would have created heavier, slower, less capable aircraft, fundamentally different from the P-51 that achieved legendary status through the same design choices that created its vulnerabilities. Robert Mitchell passed away in 2007 at 90 years old, buried in Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Los Angeles, with an obituary noting his World War II service as an aircraft mechanic, without mentioning the 19 pilots he witnessed perish or the cooling systems he diligently maintained despite their fatal limitations. His Los Angeles garage remains operational under different ownership, while a faded photograph in the back office preserves the image of a young mechanic in coveralls standing beside a P-51 Mustang, dated April 1944 in England. This enduring legacy illustrates warfare's inherent vulnerability paradox. Sometimes the most brilliant weapons contain the most critical weaknesses, and the very features that make an aircraft exceptional also render it fragile. The P-51 Mustang could escort bombers to Berlin and return safely, yet a single bullet penetrating its cooling system could bring it down, a truth behind the legend that cost hundreds of Allied pilots their lives due to an irreparable design flaw.